Emily never planned for her mornings to become predictable, yet every day she found herself at the small cafe on the corner of Maple Street. She was young, in her mid-20s, full of dreams but carrying more doubts than certainty. The coffee there wasn't particularly special, but it gave her comfort, the quiet, the smell of roasted beans, the chance to escape her restless thoughts. She always sat at the same spot, second table from the window, notebook in hand. She wanted to write a novel, but most days the pages stayed blank. Her pen hovered above the paper, her mind crowded with words that refused to come together. It was in those same mornings that she began noticing him. James. He came in like clockwork, almost 60, tall, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes with age. His silver hair caught the light from the window, and his eyes had a softness that suggested he had seen life in all its forms. The triumphs, the heartbreaks, the ordinary days that make up a lifetime. He ordered the same thing every time: black coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. He would sit near the window, never in a rush, always with a calmness that contrasted with the world outside. At first, Emily barely looked at him. She was too focused on her notebook, or at least pretended to be. But little by little, she began to notice the small details. The way he stirred his coffee twice before sipping, the way he always removed his watch and placed it carefully on the table as though time itself needed to rest, the way he nodded politely to the barista who knew his name. It was subtle, yet something about his presence settled the noise inside her. He seemed to carry a peace she couldn't find within herself. For weeks, their mornings overlapped without a single word exchanged. She wrote, or tried to, while he sipped his coffee and read a worn paperback. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. In fact, it felt like an invisible thread slowly weaving itself between two strangers. There was something reassuring about seeing him there every day, as if the universe had given her a quiet companion without asking. One morning, as the sun filtered softly through the cafe's window, James looked up from his book and caught Emily staring at her blank page again. She quickly lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but instead of pretending he hadn't noticed, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying a kindness that made it impossible to feel defensive. "You always look like you're searching for something on that page," he said, his lips lifting in the smallest smile. Emily froze, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected him to notice, let alone comment. For a moment she thought about brushing it off, but there was something about the way he said it, not mocking, not casual, but honest, like he had been observing quietly all along. She looked up, her heart thudding faster than she wanted to admit. "Maybe I am," she whispered. The space between them shifted. It was a simple exchange, only a handful of words, yet it felt like the start of something she couldn't explain. He didn't press further, didn't ask what she was searching for, didn't pry into her thoughts. He simply nodded, as though he understood without needing an explanation, and returned to his coffee. But Emily couldn't focus after that. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her pen. For the first time in weeks, she wrote a line, just one, but it was something. The next morning, Emily found herself dressing a little quicker, walking a little faster to the cafe, as though afraid she might miss him. She told herself it was silly, that it didn't matter whether a stranger sat near her or not. But when she walked in and saw him already there, a small wave of relief washed over her. He looked up briefly, offered a polite nod, then went back to his book. She sat down, notebook open, and pretended to focus, though her eyes kept drifting toward him. It wasn't love, not in the ordinary sense. She didn't even know his name yet, but it was something that made her mornings less lonely, something that gave her a reason to keep showing up, even when her words refused to come. Days passed. Sometimes their eyes met, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes he smiled faintly at her frustrated sighs when her pen refused to cooperate. She noticed the lines on his face, not harsh, but softened by time. She noticed how he seemed content in his solitude, yet also quietly present, as if he wasn't cut off from the world but simply comfortable in his own company. She envied that. At her age, her life felt messy and uncertain, but he seemed steady, like an anchor she didn't know she needed. Then one morning, something unusual happened. The cafe was busier than normal, filled with chatter and clinking cups. Emily's usual seat was taken, and so was the one beside it. She hesitated near the counter, unsure where to sit. That was when James looked up from his table by the window and motioned lightly toward the empty chair across from him. "Looks like today. You'll have to share," he said, his voice calm. Unhurried, Emily's heart skipped. For a moment she thought about refusing, about choosing another seat across the room, but something in his tone reassured her. It wasn't forward, it wasn't demanding, it was simply an invitation. She walked over, set her notebook on the table, and sat down across from him. Up close, she noticed details she hadn't before. The faint scar near his temple, the way his eyes carried both kindness and a trace of sadness, the way his hands, slightly worn, veins visible, wrapped around his coffee cup with a steadiness that contrasted with her own restless fingers. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, then studied her for a moment. "You come here often," he remarked. She smiled faintly. "Every morning. Me too," he replied. Then after a pause, he added, "Funny how we've both been here all this time, and yet this is the first time we're sharing a table." Emily felt her cheeks warm. "Maybe it took the right morning," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, she felt seen in a way that made her chest tighten. It wasn't romantic yet. It wasn't anything defined, but it was real. And that morning, something shifted quietly between them. Their mornings would never be the same again. From that morning onward, Emily and James stopped being silent strangers. What began as two people sharing the same cafe slowly turned into something much more meaningful. The first time they sat together, their words were few, but the comfort was undeniable. By the next day, she found herself walking directly to his table, instead of hesitating near the counter. He didn't question it. He simply moved his newspaper aside as though he had been expecting her. Their conversations began simply. She asked about the book he was reading, and he asked about her notebook. He told her he preferred novels that dug deep into people's lives rather than stories filled with action. She admitted that she was trying to write, but often felt like a fraud, as if her words weren't worth the page. James listened, really listened, without interruption. It wasn't the kind of half-hearted attention people usually gave. It was steady, patient, like he valued every word she said. One morning, she confessed she hadn't written anything for weeks. Her voice carried both frustration and defeat. James stirred his coffee slowly, thinking before he spoke. "You're too focused on being perfect," he said calmly. "Sometimes you just need to write badly until the good parts show up." His advice was simple, but it sank into her like truth she had been waiting to hear. That evening, she actually wrote a few pages. They weren't great, but they existed, and she realized that she might not have done it if not for him. Day after day, their talks grew longer. He began sharing pieces of his past. He spoke of his youth, of driving across the country with a guitar in his back seat, chasing music and adventure. He laughed as he described how he once slept in his car outside a gas station because he had no money for a motel. Emily's eyes lit up listening to him. To her, he wasn't just an older man in a cafe. He was a story himself, living proof that life could be unpredictable and wild, and still meaningful in the end. But not all his stories were filled with laughter. One morning while the cafe was quiet, he admitted softly that he had loved once in a way he thought would last forever. He didn't go into every detail, but Emily understood enough from the way his eyes turned distant. Something precious had slipped away from him, something that had shaped the lines of sorrow she sometimes noticed on his face. He didn't ask for pity, and she didn't offer any. Instead, she said, "Maybe that's why you understand people so well. You've lived what most only imagine." James smiled faintly, as though her words touched something inside him. "Or maybe I've just had enough years to learn," he replied. Emily began to feel that every morning was a class, though not in the traditional sense. He wasn't teaching her about writing or literature. He was teaching her about life, about patience, about carrying heartbreak without letting it destroy you, about noticing small things that mattered, like the way sunlight moved across the floor, or how the first sip of coffee could quiet the mind. These lessons weren't spoken as advice. They were hidden in his stories, in the way he looked at the world. In return, Emily opened up about herself. She told him about her childhood, how she had always been the dreamer, how teachers once praised her imagination, but how life had slowly chipped away at her confidence. She spoke about her parents who wanted her to find a real career, and the pressure she felt to be someone she wasn't ready to be. James never judged her. Instead, he said things like, "There's more time than you think," or, "The path doesn't have to be straight to be right." Their tables grew closer until, eventually, there was only one table for the both of them. Each morning they sat side by side, their mugs close, their conversations flowing as naturally as the rising sun. They didn't plan it, yet the routine became unshakable. By the time Emily reached the cafe door, she knew James would already be there, waiting. And every time James lifted his head from his book and saw her walk in, his eyes softened, as though she was the reason he kept coming back. It wasn't only the words that bonded them, it was the silences too. There were mornings when neither felt like talking much, and yet the quiet between them was never heavy. She would scribble in her notebook while he read, and though they hardly spoke, she felt connected to him. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of understanding, of comfort, of an invisible closeness that didn't need to be explained. Soon, she began noticing how others looked at them. A man almost 60 and a woman in her 20s. It didn't fit into the ordinary picture of friendship or companionship. People in the cafe sometimes whispered, sometimes stared for longer than they should. Emily felt the weight of their curiosity, the unspoken questions about who they were to each other. At first, it made her self-conscious, but James never seemed bothered. His calm presence reminded her that what they shared was theirs alone, and no one else's opinion mattered. One morning, she couldn't resist asking, "Do you ever wonder what people think about us?" Her tone was nervous, almost apologetic. James set his mug down, his gaze steady on her. "People see what they want to see," he said gently. "They don't understand everything and they don't need to. What matters is what's real to us." His words stayed with her. She realized then that he wasn't afraid of judgment because he had lived too much life to let it control him. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn that from him too. Their mornings became more than a routine. They became a lifeline. Emily began to feel lighter, as though his presence gave her strength she didn't know she needed. He began to look forward to her laughter, her stories, the way her youth reminded him of a time he thought was long gone. There was no label to what they had. It wasn't a typical friendship, nor could it be easily named. It was simply a bond that made the days brighter for both of them. And though neither said it out loud, both knew. If one of them ever stopped coming, the mornings would never be the same again. The cafe had become their private world, but the truth was, it wasn't hidden. Every morning, other people were there too. Students rushing with laptops, workers grabbing coffee on their way to offices, older couples reading newspapers. And yet, when Emily and James sat together, it felt as though time slowed around them. They leaned in when they spoke, their laughter carrying lightly across the room. It wasn't hard for others to notice. A man in his late 50s with silver hair and quiet wisdom, and a woman in her 20s with restless energy and wide, curious eyes. It wasn't a combination people saw every day. Some glanced quickly and looked away. Others lingered with curious stares. A few whispered to each other when they thought Emily couldn't hear. At first, she brushed it off, too lost in their conversations to care. But as days turned into weeks, she began to feel the weight of those stares. She saw how people's eyes narrowed when James leaned closer to her, or how their expressions shifted when she laughed too brightly at something he said. She noticed the way baristas exchanged small glances. It was subtle, but she caught it. And with each passing day, the unspoken question grew louder in her mind. What do they think we are? One morning, when the cafe was less crowded, she decided to ask. Her notebook lay closed on the table, her hands nervously wrapped around her mug. James was reading, his glasses perched on his nose. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. Do you think people find us strange? she asked softly, almost afraid of her own words. James looked up, adjusting his glasses, studying her expression. He didn't answer immediately. He stirred his coffee twice, just as he always did, then set the spoon down carefully. "People don't always understand what doesn't fit their picture of normal," he said at last. His tone was calm, as if this truth had never shaken him. Emily frowned slightly. "So you do notice?" "Of course," he replied with a small smile. "I'm not blind, but it doesn't matter." She tilted her head, searching his face. "Doesn't it ever bother you? That people might think—" She trailed off, not finishing the sentence, unsure if she even wanted to hear the end of it. James leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Emily, let me tell you something. When you live long enough, you learn that people will always find something to talk about. If it's not this, it'll be something else. If you spend your life trying to satisfy their picture of you, you'll never truly live your own." His words were simple, but they sank deep into her chest. He wasn't dismissing her concern. He was giving her a choice. To either carry the weight of strangers' eyes, or to focus on the quiet truth they shared at their table. Emily sat in silence for a moment, her throat tight. Then she gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. She realized that James wasn't unaffected because he was careless. He was unaffected because he had already lived through judgment, through whispers, through expectations that never matched his reality, and he had come out on the other side with a peace she longed to have. Still, she couldn't stop herself from wondering. To others, was she naive? Was he seen as inappropriate for sitting so close to her? She hated that her mind wandered there, because when she looked at James, she didn't see an older man. She saw someone who made her mornings brighter, someone who listened, someone who believed in her words when she didn't believe in them herself. Their bond wasn't about age, it was about connection. But she couldn't deny that the world around them had a way of painting things in harsher colors. The next morning, the cafe was crowded again. Students filled tables with textbooks spread wide, businessmen tapped loudly on laptops, and the air was thick with voices. Emily sat with James, leaning forward as he told her a story about a road trip he once took along the coast. She laughed, louder than she meant to, and caught sight of a pair of women near the counter watching them, whispering behind their cups. Her laughter faltered. She looked down at her notebook, pretending to write. James noticed instantly. His voice grew quieter, softer, almost protective. "Don't let them take this from you," he said. She met his eyes, startled. He didn't glance toward the women or acknowledge the whispers. He only looked at her, as if she was the only one in the room that mattered. "How do you do that?" she asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Stay calm when people look. Stay." "Sure." James leaned forward, his hands resting around his cup. "Because I know what this is. And I know it's real. I don't need anyone else to name it for me." His words steadied her. She realized then that her doubts weren't about James. They were about herself, about her fear of stepping outside the boxes the world had drawn. But as she looked at him, at the quiet conviction in his eyes, she felt a shift. Maybe what mattered wasn't whether others understood. It was whether she dared to. That morning ended with silence between them, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with something new, something unspoken yet undeniable. When Emily walked out of the cafe, the cool air brushing her face, she knew things had changed. She couldn't ignore it anymore. What they had wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the kind of companionship people expected, but it was theirs. And though the world might question it, whisper about it, even frown at it, neither of them wanted to walk away. For Emily, it was a lifeline, a piece of certainty in her chaotic world. For James, it was a spark he hadn't felt in years, a reminder that even after decades, life could still surprise him. And for both, it was something they didn't need to explain, something they simply chose to protect. Still, Emily knew deep inside that the whispers outside their little world were only going to get louder. And the question she wasn't ready to ask hung silently in the air. How long can we stay in this delicate balance before the world forces us to face it? The morning she almost didn't go began like any other, but everything inside Emily felt different. She woke up restless, her thoughts tangled in doubt. For weeks, her bond with James had grown stronger, yet so had the questions she couldn't silence. She thought about the whispers in the cafe, the looks people gave them, the invisible wall of judgment that surrounded something they never dared to name. She was in her 20s, standing at the edge of her life, while James had already lived through so many seasons. A quiet voice in her head asked if she was building something real, or holding on to something that could only end in heartbreak. She sat on the edge of her bed, notebook closed on the desk, coffee growing cold in the mug by her hand. She told herself she should stay home, just once. She could use the morning to write. She could break the pattern before it became something she couldn't undo. She could prove to herself that she wasn't dependent on him. But when she pictured the cafe window, the table by the corner, and James waiting with his steady calmness, her chest tightened. The thought of not seeing him left an ache too heavy to ignore. By the time she pulled on her coat, she knew she had lost the argument. Her feet carried her down Maple Street, each step quickened by an urgency she didn't fully understand. When she pushed open the cafe door, her breath caught. He was there, as always. A book rested on the table. Steam rose from his mug, but his eyes weren't on the page. They were on the door, waiting. The moment he saw her, relief flickered across his face, so quick and subtle that most would have missed it. But Emily saw. "I thought you weren't coming today," James said when she sat down. His voice was low, softer than usual. Her throat tightened. She forced a smile, though her hands trembled slightly around her notebook. "I almost didn't." James studied her for a long moment. His eyes were kind, but there was something else there too. Concern, maybe even fear. He didn't ask why. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers lightly. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the casual touch of strangers. It was deliberate, careful, warm. He didn't hold on, but he didn't pull away immediately either. The contact was brief, yet it carried more weight than words could. Emily froze. Her breath caught, her chest rising sharply as the moment passed between them. She didn't move her hand, didn't flinch, didn't break the quiet. For a heartbeat, the world outside the cafe disappeared. When he withdrew his hand, it wasn't out of rejection, but respect. His eyes searched hers, as if waiting for her to turn away, to deny what had just happened. But she didn't. She let the silence linger, her cheeks warm, her heart racing. That morning, they spoke less than usual, but every word, every glance, every pause carried a new electricity. It was as if a line had been crossed, not in a reckless way, but in a tender one. Something fragile had been acknowledged, and there was no way to return to the innocence of before. Emily tried to focus on her notebook, but the words blurred. She found herself studying him instead, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. When he smiled faintly, the calm strength in his posture, the way his presence felt like a shield against everything outside the cafe. She realized she had grown used to relying on that presence, maybe more than she should. And yet, she couldn't imagine giving it up. James, too, seemed quieter that morning. He tapped his fingers gently against the side of his cup, his gaze shifting off into the window. But when his eyes landed back on her, they softened, as though he was memorizing her face. Emily wondered what he was thinking, what battles he was fighting silently inside. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, her voice was a whisper. "Do you ever feel like this? Whatever this is, scares you?" James's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was sadness in it. "All the time," he admitted. Her chest tightened at his honesty. She had expected him to brush it off, to reassure her with calm certainty. Instead, he gave her the truth, raw and simple. It made her trust him even more. The rest of the morning passed in gentle quiet. They didn't need to name what they were. They didn't need to define it. But as they stood to leave, Emily felt something had changed forever. They were no longer just two strangers sharing mornings. They were bound by something invisible, but real, something fragile enough to break, yet strong enough to carry them forward. Walking home, Emily's thoughts raced. She realized she couldn't keep pretending this was ordinary. She had seen it in his eyes when she almost didn't come, felt it in his hand when it touched hers. They both needed this more than they were willing to admit. And though the world outside might never understand, inside that cafe, in those stolen mornings, they had created something precious. But along with the warmth came fear. Because now, the question that lingered at the edges of her mind grew sharper. How long could something so delicate last? Would time, judgment, or life itself eventually pull it apart? She pushed the thought away, clutching her notebook tighter against her chest. For now, what mattered was that she had gone. She hadn't stayed home. She hadn't let fear win. And in doing so, she had discovered just how much that quiet bond truly meant. As the sun rose higher, spilling light across Maple Street, Emily whispered to herself, almost as if making a promise, "I won't let go of this. Not yet." And somewhere back in the cafe, James lingered a little longer at the window, his coffee cooling, his thoughts far away. He knew, as she did, that something fragile had been spoken in silence that morning. And once spoken, it could never be taken back. The seasons shifted quietly, but for Emily and James, each morning at the cafe felt timeless. What began as chance encounters had turned into something neither could imagine living without. Their routine was simple: coffee, conversation, silence when needed, but it carried a weight deeper than either admitted out loud. Each day added another thread to the bond between them, weaving something fragile yet undeniable. Autumn came, painting the trees along Maple Street in shades of gold and red. Emily would sometimes arrive with leaves caught in her hair, laughing as she brushed them away. James noticed how her laughter carried like sunlight, filling the space between them. Winter followed, and though the air grew sharp, their mornings remained warm, wrapped in the comfort of presence. She brought scarves and notebooks. He brought stories and wisdom. And together they created a world that belonged only to them. But time, as James knew better than anyone, never stood still. He felt it more with each passing day, the years he carried, the distance between their ages. For Emily, life stretched forward, open and waiting. For him, it was different. His path had already curved, already given him decades she had yet to live. He found himself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was selfish to hold her here, tethered to something that might one day hurt her, more than heal her. Emily, though younger, wasn't blind. She saw the way his hands lingered longer on the coffee cup some mornings, the pauses in his stories, the shadow of thoughts he didn't voice. She wanted to ask, to demand he tell her everything weighing on his mind, but she held back. Something about James made her respect silence, and yet the fear of losing him grew in her chest like a quiet storm. The morning it all came to a turning point was colder than usual. A thin frost covered the windows of the cafe, blurring the world outside. Emily walked in, cheeks flushed from the chill, and found James already waiting. But there was something different about him. He looked tired, his silver hair catching the gray light, his expression soft but heavy. When she sat down, she noticed he wasn't reading, wasn't sipping his coffee. He was simply watching her. "You look serious," she said, trying to break the weight between them. James gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose I am." Her chest tightened. "What is it?" He exhaled slowly, the steam from his cup curling upward like a secret leaving his chest. "Emily, I think about you more than I should," he said quietly. "And I think about what this means, what we're doing. I worry that one day you'll look back and wonder why you gave so much of your time to someone who's already lived most of his years." The words landed like stones in her chest. She wanted to protest, to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but his eyes held such honesty that she couldn't dismiss it. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You think this doesn't matter to me? That it's something I'll just forget?" James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. No, I know it matters. That's why I'm afraid, because the more it matters, the more it could hurt. Silence wrapped around them. Outside, people hurried down the street, lives rushing forward. Inside, time slowed, and the only thing that existed was the weight of what was unspoken. Emily blinked back the sting in her eyes. She wanted to tell him she didn't care about the years between them, that the bond they had was worth whatever pain might come. But she also saw the truth in his face. He wasn't doubting her feelings. He was protecting her from the cost of them. At last, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his hand. This time she didn't hesitate. She held his hand firmly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I don't need forever, she whispered. I just need now, these mornings. You. His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked younger, as if her words had lifted years from his shoulders. But then his gaze turned gentle, almost sorrowful. He squeezed her hand once, then let it go. Emily, he said, his voice carrying both love and ache. The best gift I can give you is to make sure you don't hold yourself back because of me. You have so much waiting ahead of you, dreams to chase, stories to write, people to meet. You can't let me be the reason you stop. Her tears slipped free, running hot against her cheeks. So what are you saying? I'm saying, he answered softly, that this may have to be our last morning like this. The words shattered something inside her. She wanted to argue, to cling, to refuse, but deep down she knew. He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't care. He was letting her go because he cared too much. They sat in silence, both fighting emotions neither wanted to show fully. Finally, James reached across the table again, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered for a moment, tender and final. Promise me one thing, he said. Promise you'll keep writing. Promise you won't stop searching for the words you were meant to put into this world. Emily nodded, her voice breaking. Only if you promise you'll keep coming here even without me. A sad smile touched his lips. I'll try. When they stood to leave, the air between them was heavy with things unsaid. At the door, Emily turned back one last time. He was still at the table, watching her with eyes that carried both sorrow and love. She wanted to run back, to stay forever, but instead she stepped outside into the cold, carrying both the ache of goodbye and the gift of what they had shared. As she walked down Maple Street, she realized something important. Some bonds don't need to last forever to change you. Some moments, even if brief, leave marks deeper than years. And though their mornings together had ended, Emily knew they would remain with her always. His stories, his wisdom, his steady presence. She would write them into her pages, carry them into her future. And James, sitting by the window with his black coffee, would carry her laughter in his memory, a reminder that even late in life, something unexpected and beautiful could still bloom. Their mornings were over, but their bond, quiet, fragile, unforgettable, would live on in both their hearts, forever.